Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with another episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have, once again, the illustrious Darrius. How you doing, Darrius?
Yeah, doing great.
You like the illustrious
Oh yeah,
opening there?
very fancy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah, so today we're continuing our series all about PowerShell. So PowerShell is something that Darrius and I know and love very well. We use it quite a bit daily and for all sorts of things. So in this episode, we're going to be discussing PowerShell for automation and orchestration and otherwise being more efficient at your job, whether that's in offensive security, doing pen testing, red teaming, that kind of thing, or if you're on the blue team, doing defensive work. Maybe you're a security analyst at a firm and you do a lot of sysadmin stuff as well. Or maybe you're a SOC analyst and you need to work with PowerShell that way. So we're going to be talking about kind of both sides of the coin here today. If you missed our previous episode, that was on PowerShell for offense. So how attackers are using and abusing PowerShell to attack organizations. And then in coming up in the next episode, we're going to be talking about the opposite side of that, which is defending against PowerShell attacks and how to mitigate them and how to, restrict PowerShell and monitor it in your environment and all that kind of good stuff. So again, this episode is about automation, orchestration, how to be more efficient, that kind of thing. So if you like these episodes, definitely let us know on social media or on our website or whatever. Leave us a comment. We would love to do more of this type of stuff. So, Darrius, why PowerShell? Should we talk about why PowerShell again?
Yeah. So if you watch the previous episode, you kind of know. But I mean, there's so many perks to PowerShell. I mean, one, it's everywhere. If you're in a Windows environment, you're going to see PowerShell. You're going to have access to PowerShell. So that's a great reason to know it. Man, there's a lot that goes into it. It's a very powerful tool. It can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be, whether it's just you using kind of some of the native commandlets or whether you getting as far as, hey, you're handling, .NET framework libraries and you kind of doing some C#-esque things.
Yep.
Last podcast said, hey, PowerShell is kind of like the gateway drug to C#.
Yep.
And
which is a gateway drug to like NIM and Rust.
Eventually, yeah, for sure.
Eventually, you just get back to C++, and just it's a cycle.
Yeah, exactly. But it starts with PowerShell. It starts. The first hit is free and it's available everywhere.
And I guess Python is somewhere scattered in there too. A lot of security people learn Python as well.
Oh, for sure. I would put, honestly, Python and PowerShell, I kind of put them kind of in the same bucket. They're both easy to read and to write, and they're very user-friendly, which is all the more reason to pick it up and learn it. I think sometimes, we get asked the question, which one should I learn? And I think, my personal answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
Just because, they're both powerful. They both really do the same thing, or have the capabilities of doing the same thing. I will say, Python sometimes may do things a little bit easier. There may be, libraries that are for Python that, make life easier compared to PowerShell. But at the end of the day, hey, if you're going to be in a Windows environment predominantly, PowerShell is the way to go. If you're going to be,
can't go wrong.
Yeah, if you're going to do sysadmin stuff, like you said, PowerShell is the way to go. But if you're going to be in more of a Linux environment, then maybe you want to, dip your foot into web development a little bit or something along those lines. And hey, Python.
Yeah, and one of the themes we're going to touch on is the simplicity of PowerShell, the inability, or not the inability, the ability to rapidly prototype, to just have an idea of, oh, I need to do something, and I just quickly, write it up in a quick PowerShell script, kind of like how you used to do back in the day with VB script. There's no compiling necessary. Like you said, it's easy to read, it's easy to write. It's a very intuitive language. I think it allows you to pipeline together commands, so you can, get a list of processes, format them, or select the ones you want, and then output it to a file all on a single line. So it's very powerful in that regard. So PowerShell is the way, the light and the truth, I guess.
Yeah, the church of PowerShell. I like it.
Yeah. So in this episode, we're talking about automation, right, and orchestration. So give us a little intro, Darrius. Your thoughts on PowerShell for automation. You wanted to talk about scale and efficiency and skill in doing a lot of these things. So let's get started on that conversation, and we'll kind of dig into some of these parts and bits.
Yeah, so I think at this point in time, and it's very important that you're implementing automation into your workflow. In fact, I would argue it's kind of in my opinion, the number one thing, but that's just because I've kind of always been the automation guy. But I mean, we're in this world now where things are rapidly changing, and so as these things are going on, automating can essentially one example, save you time. It's very tough to try to deal with technical debt or to implement cutting edge technology and new things when you're still stuck manually doing tasks. And so really it just comes down to, I mean, you're going to be more efficient first and foremost. Because now instead of you having to, and an example I like to think of is like user management, like, okay, we have a new user. Now, instead of, okay, we need someone to go take the computer and manually install this and then manually log in and then manually configure, like all of that, it's just, hey, turn on the computer, plug something in, click start on the script, you're done. That's going to save you so much time and give you so much free time. I think another thing to think about is like scale. So I also think way, way, way back to my support days where it's just like, hey, we need to rename every single computer in the company. And you know how we're going to do it? We're going to go door by door, door by door, and tell people that. And this is very much so like that doesn't scale well in a lot of environments. Well, by automating that process, boom, now you're able to do something like that, and it just makes life a lot easier. And so ultimately, you end up enhancing your environment. You end up now you're able to learn and touch new things. And I also think if you really want to know if someone knows a process really well, tell them to automate it, because at that point it requires you to really break down and know each step.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is, automating something is a great way to learn how that thing works or how that process works because of exactly that point, right? So in my case, if I want to obfuscate a script or something, right? I can't just, tell it to obfuscate. There are tools that will automate that for you that you can buy and that are open source. But if you want to do it yourself, right, and have control over how you're handling input and output and stuff like that, you got to know the bits and pieces of that script, for example, and how that works and how that's put together. Same example, same thing with your example with automating, some sysadmin tasks. If you want to automate, some rudimentary thing on an endpoint across thousands of endpoints, you have to know how that works. You have to know how errors are going to be handled, right? That's another important aspect of automation is handling errors and handling, unique scenarios that aren't necessarily, stuff that succeeds all the time. There's errors, there's little intricacies and things. There's use cases for everything, right? So all that ties into this automation discussion.
For sure. I think there's also, we talk about there being, there's the skill gap within the industry sometimes. And, I think this is another way where automation can kind of come in hand to tackle that. And truthfully, I'm still kind of on the fence on it sometimes because it's like on the one hand, man, for someone that's entry level, they're green, they're trying to gain that experience. A lot of times doing things manually is a great way to learn. But if you're dropped into an environment where someone just says, hey, whenever you need to do this thing, just run this script, you're probably not going to learn as much. But on the other hand, it is helpful to be able to kind of remove the human element to an extent. So there's definitely, I think kind of an ethical discussion there and of like, what is that balance?
Yeah, and I think it's important too when you're learning something that you don't just begin with the automation, right? You learn what for example, Nmap. Like if you want to automate some sort of vulnerability discovery or endpoint recon or something like that, Don't just download a script, like auto recon, right? Is a great example. Don't just run auto recon and just use that as your tool if you're just starting out, right? Learn what those different nmap commands are. Learn what the ports do. Learn the services and learn what those things do, so that when you do run into an issue or you have some fringe case or you run into something, you kind of can understand it better, and you're not at the mercy, of that tool. If that tool is no longer supported, and now your automation system breaks, do you know how to rebuild it?
Yep.
And so building it from the ground up is an important part of that.
Agreed.
So learning, right? How do you learn? How to go about doing this, or what's your advice, Darrius, or kind of getting into this a little bit better?
Oh man. So I think the thing about PowerShell is you kind of just have to do it, but that's the best way to learn, which, seems kind of cliche, but it's I think is the truth. But to kind of help you with that, right? Some things that I can recommend is, first off, the book Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. I think that book is just perfect. It'll help you get a solid foundation, regardless of even if you like read the whole thing or not. You're going to, at the bare minimum, understand syntax, and I think that's really helpful.
Yep.
And honestly, I think going through that book will get you about 75% of the way there, as far as, hey, you at least now know how to read and write, and just some basic um, foundational concepts, like looping and conditional statements and things of that nature. I think that book is perfect. And the other piece of advice that I like to give people is start using PowerShell for everything. Um, and like that right there, you're going to learn very quickly, how to do things. So, example, let's say you're a sysadmin, you need to make a change in AD. For sure, you can open up the GUI and do it that way, and it's probably going to be faster at first. But I challenge you to use PowerShell to do those things first. And as you continue to do it, eventually you'll get so fast with it that you'll be like, wow, man, why does anyone use the GUI when you can just 2 seconds type out this commandlet and boom, now you're there.
Yep.
So those are kind of the two major things I can say. Like, hey, if you're trying to learn, great way to start.
Yeah. And I think it's always interesting watching somebody else operate in a shell, right? Because they have their own, way of doing things. So, for example, there's, you and I were on a pen test once, and, you were kind of hands on the keyboard and I was watching, and you were, doing things, running commands differently than I would if I were on the command line, right? Like just, opening files or creating new directories or listing things. There's so many commandlets, there's so many modules and aliases for everything that everybody has their own unique style, right? Same with Linux, right? Linux is, even more obvious when you start seeing people operate on the shell in their differences. But that brings me to the point. There's so many different ways to do things that, to your point, Darrius, just start doing them. Start working on a project. If you have an idea, start poking at it and learning the language and learning the syntax and learning the concepts through that project.
For sure. And speaking of concepts, since you said it, just to do a little bit of PowerShell training, for those who are listening who are new to it. While there are tons of concepts, I think some of the major ones, specifically we're talking about automations, it's just kind of one, the concept of modules, which if you're a Python person, these are essentially libraries. In most cases, when you're automating things, when you're scripting, right, you're just chaining commands together. And so if you can find a module that covers what you're trying to do, which is like, and most of the time that's what's going to happen, you're golden. At that point, you import your module, you run your commandlets, you're good to go. I think eventually you get to the point where you'll develop your own modules, which I think is really fun because it makes it, PowerShell's pretty easy at packaging all that up together. So definitely want to learn the concept, focus on the concept of modules. PowerShell Gallery is your friend. And then the other concept, speaking of just modules and PowerShell Gallery being your friend, I mean, you have the Azure PowerShell module that in and of itself is extremely powerful from both a blue team and a red team perspective. I mean, Spencer, if you get on a box and you see, oh wow, the PowerShell, the Azure module is already on this box. That's going to start. I imagine, that starts lighting,
Oh yeah, definitely.
flags.
Like a recent pen test we were on. In this case, it didn't have those modules because it was an older server that was migrated. But you remember that pen test we did. We're like, oh, we got in this server, and we look at the metadata service, and we try to pivot to a service principal or whatever. Yeah, that's definitely very helpful from an offensive perspective. So knowing those things and how to use them, at least from rudimentary standpoint or introductory,
Sure.
is definitely helpful.
Yeah, and then I also think of like, man, if I see the Azure module already on here, is there a chance that there are creds, already stored in cache? There's a good chance, So,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely want to get familiar with that. And the other thing I would say is, this isn't necessarily PowerShell specific, but just generally, just API knowledge. It's always going to be helpful, no matter what platform you're automating in.
Yep.
So, like if you can't find an official module for what you're trying to do, well, in a lot of cases, you can find an API. And so at that point,
Yep.
hey, you're golden. You can automate whatever you want to. Invoke REST method, like that right there is probably the commandlet I use the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another great resource if you're just now starting out with APIs is Postman. So like Postman is kind of a GUI interface for consuming APIs, and the best part about it is it gives you the ability to kind of export what you've done in the GUI to a language of your choice, including PowerShell.
Yeah, and a use case for this that I've experienced with is have kiosks, those kiosks that are in the front of buildings and stuff, and they'll show like the weather and like the news and maybe updates from the company and stuff like that. Well, maybe you're in IT and HR wants you to automate welcoming guests to the building or new employees, right? And that kiosk has some API, right, that you can interface with. Maybe it's in Python, maybe you can do it PowerShell, but the fact of the matter is knowing how to interact with an API in some language. In this case, we're talking about PowerShell. So knowing how to interact with the API with invoke REST method and how to update information, remove information, query, the endpoints and stuff like that is going to be super helpful. And if you know that, you can kind of whip it up together and no big deal, as opposed to, having to struggle and kind of learn the language and figure it out. And it just provides a lot of value.
For sure. Do you have any tips and tricks?
Oh, I got lots of tricks. I like here in the notes how you have get help. Get help is like you say, Darrius, your best friend. It could be super helpful. I always, as of recently, if I am looking at code, specifically in another language other than PowerShell, because I'm pretty familiar with PowerShell, but it goes the same with PowerShell. My kind of tip or trick is to put it into ChatGPT, copy paste it and say, what does this do? That's really helpful, for understanding a code block. Like if you're not sure what it does, copy and paste it into ChatGPT, be like, what does this do? What does this do? Or how can I, change this to do X, Y, and Z? Or obfuscate this for me.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's actually a great tip actually, because we now have access to these tools, so I can imagine ChatGPT being great for this type of workflow. Did not exist when I was first starting out and learning, but now that it's here, yeah, for sure. Like,
and to the point of the episode, right? ChatGPT has an API. You can automate some of the stuff that you want. So if you are, automating some sort of, tool that you need for offensive or defensive purposes, you could maybe, use ChatGPT as a linting tool. Just an idea. And if you're not familiar with ChatGPT, it now has a code module. So maybe there's some potential there to use that API and use it as some sort of linting tool. And linting, I mean, is like syntax checking, right? Checking for errors, checking for things that are going to mess up your code. So maybe you run it through an API, the ChatGPT API, and look for errors or something like that, or tell you how you can make it more efficient or something like that. And you can automate some of your workflow that way. But yeah, get-help is really good too if you want to stay on the command line. another kind of tip related to that is PowerShell API or PowerShell Chat GPT. I forget the name of the module exactly, but it's a command line version of Chat GPT through PowerShell. It's a PowerShell
That's
module.
cool.
Yeah, and I'll have to remember to put it in the show notes. I'll link to it. But it's really cool. You just run it from the command line. You say, Chat GPT, what does this code do? Or write me a function template for this, and it'll spit it out. And you stay right on the command line, like you were advocating.
Nice. I know there's a couple of other tips and tricks, but we don't have to touch on each one, but to kind of quickly talk about some of them. This is personal preference, but find a IDE that works for you. By default, you're always going to have PowerShell ISE on the box more than likely. So that's a my place to kind of quickly prototype and do things.
And you gotta quickly move to VS Code, or Darrius will make fun of you for using ISE.
No, my personal opinion, especially once you get to more complex things, I personally think VS Code is better. Some of the PowerShell stuff for VS Code, it just works really nice, and you get things that you don't get that you don't get in ISE.
Yeah, and I always say that because I'll share a POC for something in our group Teams chat, and I'll throw a screenshot, be like, "Oh, I'm working on this cool thing," and Darrius is like, "Oh yeah, it's an ISE or whatever." But it's all in good fun.
Yeah, I'm a VS Code and PowerShell fanboy. Yep. I love it. I think Microsoft just go ahead and include VS Code by default into the operating system.
Yeah, and there's an ISE mode in VS Code. So if you're really, really into ISE, there is an ISE mode in VS Code, which I use sometimes.
Yep. But I was also understand the concept of learning of the pipeline and piping things together. Like Spencer, like you said earlier, drastically improves your workflow for things because now you'll run one command, pipe it to another command, and at this point, yep. You have this whole string. You take was initially maybe 50 lines of code is now a one-liner. Yep. So that's something that's really helpful.
And that's like the I don't know what the word is for it, but that's like the rubber stamp of you've made it in PowerShell when you take 50 lines and you make it a one-liner. That's the cool thing to do is you take your code, right? And it's just whatever. And then you put it in a one-liner. That's the trick, right? That's the
you've made it.
Yeah, you've made it when you turn your script into a one-liner, because now you can brag to all your friends and coworkers I made this script a one-liner.
Yeah, and as you brag, they're just like, okay, but it's fine.
Exactly. It's yeah, cool. It's harder to read. It's harder to debug, but it's in one line. It fits in a tweet.
So there's definitely, I think that's kind of interesting to kind of close to I think the next big tip I would say is, learn and follow best coding practices from the beginning. Because, once you form your habits and how you do things, it's hard to break them. And so that kind of turns into, I think alias use and one-liners and things of that nature, very awesome and helpful for stuff that you're just doing yourself, or even just stuff where you're like, hey, you don't need to understand this, just hit run. But I do think once you start working with a team, or if you're collaborating with something, then you'll probably, want to break that out a little bit more. But some other just best practices I'll say is leave creds out of scripts. It's 2023, but Spencer, I mean, come on, you still see it from time to time. If you see a script, whether it's a bash script, a PowerShell script, etc., there's a good chance you're going to find credentials.
Yeah, every engagement, I would say we find credentials in some kind of script somewhere. Logon script, PowerShell VB script, SQL query, you name it, something.
And there are ways to programmatically handle that now without just having everything out and available. So just do it from the start.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say too is learning, when you mentioned learning best practices and learning how to do things right, especially for offensive security, but defensive security, whether you're an IT admin or whatever, you have to learn how the thing works in order to break it. Right. So especially when it comes to pen testing, it's you have to learn the rules so you know how to break them. And that is ever so clear when it comes to PowerShell and automation, is you have to learn the rules so you know how things work, so you know how to break them and how to kind of manipulate them for whatever it is you're trying to achieve.
I can agree with that. And if you look, I'd say if you're looking for just general guidelines and best practices, there's this GitHub. It's Posh code. And like that right there was kind of when I like that is kind of the standard that I try to hold myself to in turn, and it covers everything from like naming conventions and scopes
Yep.
and just everything you could possibly want. So definitely say, hey, check them out.
Yep.
Um, yeah. So now I guess you want to go over kind of I think, the most exciting part of this episode, just kind of just use cases and examples.
Yeah, definitely. We had some use cases that we're thinking of talking about in this episode of like, how does this apply? Like, how do we take what we were just talking about for the first 20 minutes and, what does this look like in practice? So I don't know if you want to go first and then I'll jump in and we can go back and forth.
Sure. So I think kind of one that I personally like is the concept of scrubbing user accounts. Just because I think you'll learn a lot about the life cycle of accounts and how Office 365 works. So here's kind of the use case, right? You have an end user and they've somehow given their creds away, and they've also hit accept on the MFA prompt, and threat actor gets in. You need a way to quickly, and so going back to being able to be efficient. Let's say it happens to a bunch of users, being able to do things at scale. Make sure that you're resetting passwords, you're revoking sessions, and just all of that nature of all that stuff. I like to call it scrubbing. That right there, I think it's a great project and script to kind of start out with. I mean, at that point, you're talking about touching multiple things. You're touching the Azure module. You maybe at that point you're touching on-prem AD, and then you can even go as far as now you're probably working with the Exchange Online module, because Spencer, one common thing threat actors do is, hey, I'm gonna add these inbox rules and things of that nature. And so just being able to one click handle a incident such as a business email compromise, I think is huge.
Yep.
And it's a pretty big win that I don't see a lot of organizations doing just yet.
Yeah, and especially if you don't have a big budget for a SOAR product or a security automation and response product, SOAR, right? And it's very common in the XDR, EDR, MDR world to have a SOAR product that does some of that automation for you, but it's very expensive, right? You can very easily and for free set up a script to do exactly what you're saying, to kind of preempt that instant response process. You can even touch the endpoint with PowerShell, right?
Yep.
Through PS remoting. And so there's a ton of ways, a ton of potential there to do things, like you said, at scale and very efficiently and quickly with PowerShell in that regard. I have one for offensive security folks. So pen testing, red teaming, stuff like that. A lot of times we need to obfuscate things. We need to obfuscate a script or obfuscate a tool or rename a script or something like that, or remove some sort of IOCs from a payload or something like that. Well, it just so happens that PowerShell is really good with working with files, right? You can ingest files in different formats. You can output files in different formats and manipulate files in all sorts of ways. You can even use regular expressions to search through files and do like a search replace kind of thing. So something that I do is I will run a PowerShell script to automate obfuscating certain scripts. So a lot of recon scripts that I have like a build for them that goes through and will obfuscate them. So every time I run them, they're completely different, right? So you can obfuscate function names and strings. Pretty much almost anything in a PowerShell script can be modified or changed or obfuscated in that way. So it's pretty good. So I create like a template. I just do a search and replace on keywords that I have for that script. And I create a build process, a build script. I just run build, and then it spits out a whole completely new obfuscated, script for me. I don't have to do any heavy lifting. I just run it, and it's new every time. So that's one way that I use it for offensive purposes, to make a completely unique script every single time.
Which is huge. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty big deal.
Yep. And to take that one step further, you could automate the discovery of the IOCs of that script, or any script for that matter, using something like threat check. So you could automate finding the IOCs with threat check and do something with them. So there's a lot of cool stuff that people have done with the automation stuff in the offensive world, especially with obfuscation and kind of creating payloads and obfuscating them, packing them, that kind of thing. So that can be very powerful, especially when obfuscation can take a lot of time, right? Especially to do it right, to do it well. If you have a process that's automated that saves you a bunch of time that you don't have to spend, doing that, and you can actually spend that on the engagement, providing value to the client.
How are we on time?
We're good. I mean, I think a couple more examples, and we should wrap it up. But
Okay.
let's do one more.
Yeah. So I think kind of just when it comes to automating in general, I'm big on, hey, try to identify the opportunities specific to your environment. So, I will say, hey, identify, take a look at like what are the processes that people complain about? What are the things that every time you have to do it, you just hate it because it's so repetitive?
Yep.
That's what you should focus on. That's what you should automate. I also kind of want to say, be creative. So one example that I give that I like that we implemented in my last place was the idea of chatbots. And so, we use Slack. And so essentially what we did was we had this bot framework to where you had this in Slack, we called it the zoo. And, we had like pandas and drafts and all these different chatbots that you could give it a command and it would essentially behind the scenes, all it's doing is taking the parameters that it was given. And now it's executing basically PowerShell in the background. I think that right there, was I think a great project and an example that I think was just really cool because now you're granting access to people who for example, the support team needs to be able to do certain things, but you also don't want to necessarily grant their account specific permissions. Well, give them the ability to do things via a chat bot, and you've now empowered that team.
Exactly. And we can use that scrubbing example that you just mentioned is, integrate a chatbot in Slack or Teams or something, right? Give it a command to do something, to do like some initial triage on a suspicious account or account that's acting suspicious or it's a suspicious login. Create a process in automation that runs, goes out, captures some logs for the last, 90 minutes, geolocates all the IPs, categorizes it all, dumps it in a file somewhere on your share or a SharePoint or something, and it does like an initial triage investigation for you, rather than going out to Purview, downloading the logs, going into Entra, downloading those logs, looking at them manually, write a script that does some of that collection, at least maybe just the collection for you, and maybe some additional, enrichment with geolocation on IPs or something, and just drop it into a file, right? Great example, something that's pretty easy to do, but can speed up that initial triage so that you don't have to spend the time you should be responding to a threat by collecting information. So that's something, for the defenders, they can take away is like, how can I automate this? Or what are some things I can do? Think about things that you need to do quickly that could be very severe, like responding to a threat or potential threat, and automate those things.
Nice.
So thoughts on that one, Darrius?
No, I am in agreement. In fact, it's funny you say that. That is exactly what we did. Shout out to, hopefully they watch this, but shout out to Patrick and Trey and a few other people who we worked on building the chatbot zoo together. That's exactly what we do. It's hey, we need to scrub an account quickly. That was the use case among some others. So you definitely, you don't want to be in a situation where you're in an incident and you're like, we need to do these things, and now you're scrambling. I can't.
Even network monitoring, right? Let's say a service goes down or something. You want to collect the logs from the last 90 minutes from the server, right? Maybe you don't have Windows Event Forwarding, but you want to get the logs locally, right? PS remoting to copy them to a share or something. Cool, quick and easy way to automate that. So there's literally something for everyone. We could sit here and come up with like hundreds of ideas, and we have.
It's like you were there with us, Spencer, because everything you're saying so far are the exact same things that we did.
As you know, I'm a recovering sysadmin. So, I mean, all these things, I did myself too. Yeah. So, these are things that are common problems for sysadmins, people in IT, security people, and you can automate them to save you a lot of trouble.
I agree. I think if you're going to be in the sysadmin or infrastructure space, you have to pick it up. I do think it's I do think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're a systems admin and you refuse to touch PowerShell. I just, you're doing yourself a disservice. You'll speed up your workflows.
Yeah,
it's worth
I
it.
agree. I agree. There's so many unlimited uses for it. If you are in a technical role, if you're not kind of CIO or director or something like that, if your hands are getting dirty and doing the work, and you don't have that skill yet, I think we both I can speak for Darrius. It would definitely benefit you to pick it up and learn it. I think it'll help your job quite a bit. No matter what role you really have. Cool. So that's all the time we have for today. Thanks everybody for listening or for watching, depending where you are. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would share it. Comment below wherever this is being posted. Check us out on offsec.blog or at secureIT360.com. And we will see you next time.